You can be as passionate as you like about protecting nature, but all the passion in the world isn't going to change a thing if the law doesn't reflect the need to protect the environment and protect our home, planet Earth. Joining me today is JoJo Mehta, Executive Director of an organization called Stop Ecocide International. It's an organization that she co-founded in 2017 alongside barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, just 2 years before Polly's untimely death. The aim was to campaign to reinstate a missing law, a missing piece of legislation that mysteriously was dropped from the statute books when the international criminal courts were putting together the Rome statutes. So this is the international legislation that criminalizes acts of genocide, of crimes against humanity, of war crimes and crimes of aggression. And there should have been a fifth crime, the crime of ecocide, harming the environment. Making ecocide a criminal act is giving international law the teeth to go after the actual people hiding behind the corporations, the big polluters. Now, it sounds complicated, but this piece of legislation is actually so simple, so intuitive, that it literally fits on the back of a business card. And it's amazing, frankly, that it's not already enshrined into law. So JoJo and I obviously talk a lot about the law and ecocide, but we also talk about home. We talk about belonging and purpose. And I came away absolutely blown away by JoJo's faith in human creativity and perseverance, but also in nature's resilience and nature's power to bounce back. JoJo, let me just give you a little bit of preamble just to give you some context of what I'm hoping to achieve with the podcast.
Okay, brilliant.
So, If I Rule the World is a podcast about system change, although I'm trying to avoid using the word system change because it took me, like when I first heard that expression, it really appealed to me. I loved the sound of it. I still do. But I realized that the more I kind of dug into it, I was like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how to make that happen. So I call system change trying to shine the light on the invisible barriers to positive change. And the reason why I say invisible barriers is I've been working in natural history, filmmaking, and media for almost 30 years now. And it took a really long time for me to get to the point where I was like, wow, there's all this good intention and all this good work. But in the 30 years that I've been doing this job, things have not just gotten worse, they've gotten exponentially worse. And why is that? And I think, I'm not alone in this. I think people are starting to kind of shine the light on, well, who are the real culprits? Who really should carry this burden of responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. So podcast about system change without using the word system change. So just to kind of just jump in, really, like I said, this is about the work behind the work, if you like. But what I wanted to ask you was, I've heard you speak, and I remember I recall you saying, when you were a child, you loved language, you loved reading, and you wanted to be a writer. So just talk to me a little bit about that.
Wow, it's not usually where I start my my speeches. So that's cool. Yeah, I think growing up, there were a couple of really big influences for me. I was an incredible bookworm. I was not one of the cool kids at school, the great at sports, popular people. I was the one in the corner with the book. And I remember as a kid taking 9 books, which was the most you were allowed to take out of the local library every week, and reading them all. And my kind of life in those stories, I suppose, almost felt kind of more real to me than the life in the world. And I always wanted to write, I suppose. And I mean, it's kind of funny because actually I spend an awful lot of my time now writing, but not what I thought when I was a child I would be writing.
Yeah.
I think I saw myself as a potential novelist, but actually most of the communications I do these days are kind of things like diplomatic emails or writing speeches and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So language has, I guess, that ability to communicate. because for me, one of the things that struck me the most about this movement is how capturing something that's almost, you would have thought is already enshrined in some kind of statute book somewhere, this idea that the planet that we depend on is also protected by the law. And I think there's a sort of a parallel story with a different word that sounds very similar to ecocide, which is genocide. I think when I really started to kind of think about the words, the power of language, it was when I read a book by Philippe Sands, who I know we can come back to later. I know he's quite important in this story of ecocide. But he wrote a book called East West Street. And in the inside cover, I'm sure you've read it, you've seen it, is a sort of a scan. And it's in the handwriting of the two lawyers. The first word is genocide. The second word is crimes against humanity. And those are the first time those words were written down with the intention of dealing with these enormous crimes. What was the big bang moment, if you like, for the word ecocide?
The word ecocide, it has a kind of 50-year history in the sense that it came into being in 1970, where it was used to describe the damage caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam, the horrific defoliant. And it was used on the diplomatic stage for the first time by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1972. And that was during the first international conference on the environment. So we're looking at the international community addressing environmental issues kind of on a global level from that time, from 1972. And it's actually really interesting to read the Stockholm Declaration, because that's where that conference was held, and see what was being said, what were the things that were said to be important to be looking at, and the dangers of what was happening. And of course, all of those things still apply now, and all of those things perhaps apply even more now. But the word ecocide kind of, it's almost like it ended up on the for decades, actually. It was kind of addressed by a couple of different lawyers over time, Richard Falk in the 1970s, Benjamin Whittaker in the 80s. And the concept, although not necessarily the word, sort of surfaced during the drafting of the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the International Criminal Court. It's the document that sets out genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity as
so this was post-World War II, that those...
Oh, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the words, as you're mentioning, the words genocide, the phrase crimes against humanity date from that time. They date from a point when sort of societally we are acknowledging that there is a kind of level of atrocity crime that has not previously been identified, if you like. And that then kind of enters the parlance as well as the legal vocabulary as a way of responding to a kind of situation, a challenge, a horror, really, at that point, that the world's experiencing. And I think that there's a reason why that word ecocide potentially, as I said, ended up on the kind of back burner, but resurfaced in the 2000s, really through the kind of advocacy work of Polly Higgins, this pioneering barrister with whom I co-founded Stop Ecocide International, and who is sadly no longer with us. She died of cancer in 2019. But she kind of resurrected that word and started to kind of bring it back into public consciousness. And I think that's no coincidence, in the sense that it's also a response to a level of challenge and also a growing sense of horror at what is happening to our planetary home. And that speaks again to the word itself, because if you go back similarly to genocide, it's a sort of combination etymologically of the Greek and the Latin. So eco, as many people know, comes from the word oikos, or home. So ecology is knowledge of the home, economy is management of the home. Ecocide, and then the side comes from the Latin to kill, is the killing of the home. And actually it speaks, I think, really deeply to what we kind of understand at a visceral level to be happening on a planetary scale. We have been killing our planetary home. And so there is something about this word that kind of captures that, and that almost has an internal momentum of its own as a result. And I think that when we look at how fast this conversation is now spreading around this concept of ecocide, around naming those worst harms to ecosystems, to the living world, as ecocide, and actually saying that these should be recognized as criminal, that has a kind of an internal energy to it that goes along with the word itself. So I think you're right. I think it's absolutely key, this sort of use of language and use of words.
So, oh my gosh, yeah. So that's one of the things that when I really stopped and thought about the word eco, I couldn't agree with you more. I felt like I was giving a talk actually, and I was using the word eco, and I just felt like this word has lost its power, its meaning. We use it so much in so many contexts, and sometimes it's almost got like this derogatory connotation, the eco-fascist, the eco-whatevers. And 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 I just thought, you think about what it means, and you think about the word home. And I mean, I don't know if it's because I have this really complex background. I've moved around all my life. And there's this kind of yearning for something I don't think I'll ever have, which is like a real sense of belonging to a place. And so for me, the word home is just like one of the most beautiful words. And yes, when you kind of combine that with this concept that we're killing it, there's an emotional resonance to that. In terms of some of the nuts and bolts, so we've got the word, we've got, okay, what does it mean? Let's get some emotion into that. But the nuts and bolts of how does this word move us forward within the context of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So I just thought, first of all, because I'm sure because you talk about there's like a familiarity, but for someone who has never heard of the International Criminal Courts, where are they? What does it look like? Have you been there?
Yeah. Okay. So the International Criminal Court is based in The Hague in the Netherlands, which is kind of the seat, I suppose, of international legal power, I suppose, or courts. I mean, because the International Court of Justice is also there. That's a different court. The International Criminal Court is the court that deals with international crimes specifically. Those are currently war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And it came into existence in 2002 as a result of the Rome Statute being signed in 1998. So it took a few years for the court itself to open its doors. And so that statute was created in order to address levels of atrocity crime that are they're not new crimes as such. What they are is a way of kind of elevating the worst atrocities to an international level and saying that nobody should be immune from prosecution. So the International Criminal Court is the only court globally where a head of state can be prosecuted, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a level above national jurisdictions. And it's different from the International Court of Justice, which deals with interstate disputes. The International Criminal Court deals with individuals. So it doesn't deal with governments. It doesn't deal with corporations as bodies. It deals with natural persons. So you, me, the CEO of a company, a minister, a head of state, if you like. And one of the reasons that Polly Higgins and ultimately, obviously, our organization aims at the International Criminal Court particularly is partly because of that. Because what we see out there in the world, if you like, is a body of environmental law that has grown up over the last few decades, but relatively young body of law compared to other aspects of law potentially. But what we also see is the fact that those laws are not taken as seriously as they should be, and that actually the biggest polluters, for example, may well be paying their expensive lawyers to work around environmental regulation, or indeed to weigh up whether the fines for breaking that regulation actually weigh up for them against the profits they're going to make. And so there's a way in which those who are making the decisions, and ultimately, of course, it is human beings who make those decisions, even if it's a board of them, those human beings can simply continue what they're doing and perhaps have a slap on the wrist or a fine. And effectively, what we do by shifting the significance of severe environmental damage into the criminal law sphere and looking at it at that level of the way that the ICC deals with crimes is that you're saying, well, you personally may actually have to take criminal responsibility. I mean, you can imagine how differently a board of directors might approach its environmental obligations, knowing that if it fails to fulfill them and threatens severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment as a result, that its members could be in criminal law territory. And there's something about that has a level of deterrence, a level of concentrating the mind, which is the way Philippe Sands often talks about it, that regulatory law simply doesn't touch because there isn't the moral stigma attached to breaking a regulation as there is to committing a crime. And so there is a way in which this speaks to the moral aspect, the kind of consciousness aspect of how we approach things as a society and what we believe is acceptable and not acceptable. And in our kind of dominant Western paradigm, as is in fact the dominant global system at present, it is criminal law that we use to draw those moral lines. So aiming at that highest court is very important for that understanding point of view. And I think the other thing that's important to say about this is that precisely because there is no foundational piece that says this level of harm to the environment is bad, wrong, and dangerous, this means that that whole body of environmental law, as I was saying earlier, it is simply not really taken seriously enough. I mean, if you're campaigning for human rights, at least you know that mass murder, torture, forced disappearance, all of these things are deeply serious crimes. I mean, can you imagine campaigning for human rights if those things were not serious crimes, if somehow they were permitted or tolerated? But that's exactly the situation we do have in the environmental sphere. And that just highlights why it's so important to have this piece acknowledged as an international level crime, ultimately.
So the Rome Statutes, they come into existence as I guess they're member states, all the member states that are signatories to the Rome Statutes. My understanding of how the four crimes, as you say, so that's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression, which that's not one we hear a lot about. But there was a fifth one that didn't make it into the books. Tell me about that.
Yes, this was something that Polly Higgins discovered when she started researching, sort of in a sense, trying to answer the question, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And one of the things that she discovered was that during the drafting of the Rome Statute, and at that time it was known as the Draft Code for the Peace and Security of Mankind, I think, there was a clause that would have addressed this severe, widespread and long-term harm to the environment. And it was one of a number of others as well that did not make the final treaty. Now, to the best of our research and knowledge, there was no actual vote on that. It simply kind of dropped out of the discussions at a certain point. And all we can say, looking back at what's minuted from those discussions, is that there were certain countries that objected to it, that didn't want it included. And interestingly, I mean, those were the US, the UK, France, and the Netherlands, interestingly, all oil states. So Polly Higgins discovered that during the drafting of what was to become the Rome Statute, there were a number of clauses that didn't make the final cut. And there was an environmental crimes clause that was among those that would have covered severe and widespread and long-term harm to the environment. But it wasn't that it was voted out. There was no vote that we can find in the records. But there were certain countries that did object to it. The US, the UK, France, the Netherlands, and at one point actually Brazil. And it's interestingly, all of those states are oil states. And certainly those key four states at that time were either looking at or engaging in nuclear testing programs. And there's some indication that that may well have been a reason why they didn't want that to make the final treaty. And of course, although one could potentially imagine that the creation of a nuclear missile in and of itself isn't ecocidal, one can certainly not imagine the use of one ever being anything else. So that's an interesting aspect in all of this as well. And I think it's not irrelevant that there has recently been this nuclear non-proliferation treaty that has been signed by a huge number of countries, actually, and that's another sort of step towards potentially moving in a different direction legally. And of course, there are some key countries that have not signed that. But one of the beauties of the way that the International Criminal Court works is that it's a one state, one vote context, like the UN. But unlike the UN, it doesn't have a Security Council and it doesn't have a veto. So actually, you don't necessarily need those biggest economies in order to move forward an amendment to that treaty. And that's a very important aspect of why it's an achievable initiative, this criminalization of ecocide in that context.
Honestly, JoJo, I think that's your book there, going into that story of what happened to the fifth, what all the dealings, because I imagine you've got sort of documents that just have the fifth crime, the missing crime, as I call it, like just disappear from any of the minutes of all these meetings. But it'd be interesting to go and speak and find the actual people that are involved in that and Well, I'm just, I want to know anyway. I'd read that book.
A little bit of a detective story there.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So many directions to go into. Just winding back to some kind of really basic things. Okay. So you referred, it's not a term I've come across. You referred to me and yourself as natural persons. I've always assumed that's what I am. But legally, there's some interesting concepts around this idea of personhood. And the idea that things that I don't consider a person have a legal personhood, yet things that should do don't. And so talk to me about all of that.
Yes, indeed. So a natural persons obviously literally means sort of walking, talking human beings. But legal persons also includes, for example, companies. For the last 150 years or so, a corporation is a legal person and can therefore be dealt with in a court of law and has, in a sense, certain sort of rights and obligations and that kind of thing that go along with having legal personhood. What is not the case is that the natural world has legal personhood. That is something that is being put forward and driven forward actually by growing global movements for nature's rights, for rights of nature. And there are now a number of, for example, particular landscape features in different jurisdictions around the world that have been given legal personhood. They've been given,
really?
they've become the subject of rights. So, for example, most famously, the Whanganui River in New Zealand, but also rivers in Bangladesh. There are some forest ecosystems in Colombia. There are a number of places in America where there are particular landscape features that have been accorded rights.
Are there any in the UK?
Not that I know of. But in fact, the first major ecosystem in Europe to be granted such rights was the Mar Menor, which is a saltwater lagoon in Spain. And that was just last year, I believe. So it's quite sort of new to this part of the world. But it's a very strong and growing movement. And ultimately, what that movement aims to do is to actually have the legal system recognize nature sort of almost in a sense in its entirety as having intrinsic rights. And that's something that would potentially be a huge legal shift, because most of our legal system has grown up around property and people and sort of the whole sort of concept of ownership and all of those kinds of things. And of course, you move into a very different sphere when you start acknowledging that nature has rights in and of itself. Now, we see the initiative towards the criminalization of ecocide as a kind of, we're not actually part of the nature rights movement. It's a separate thing, but it's parallel and it's complementary. And one simple way of describing that is simply to say that our basic human right, which is the right to life, is protected by the fact that to take that life away is a crime. In other words, murder is a crime. If murder was not a crime, your right to life might not be, in practice, worth nearly as much. And so that same principle, if you like, can apply in the sphere of the environment, of the natural world, where effectively the criminalization of mass damage to nature is a protective element in relation to the rights of nature, but also in relation to the newly acknowledged UN human right to a clean, safe and healthy environment. So it's an important complement. And I think the other thing as well to say is that the two don't necessarily require each other to come into existence. So if you think about this, it's quite logical. I mean, the whole human rights phenomenon, if you like, conversation, legal acknowledgement is actually relatively young, a couple of 100 years. But of course, the crime of murder goes back thousands and thousands of years, if not to the beginnings of human society. So effectively, you don't have to have those rights in place in order to criminalize damage and criminalize harm. And we actually see ecocide law as a kind of a bridging piece in a way. On one level, it's very specific. And actually, that's one of the things that makes it so simple to advocate for. We don't have a whole raft of kind of changes that we're interested in governments implementing. We have this one thing: criminalize the worst harms to nature, recognize them as crimes. And that's very, very simple and straightforward and achievable and doable. And the Rome Statute even has amendment procedures that have been used previously successfully. So this is a very sort of doable route. At the same time, what we're doing by placing ecocide alongside genocide is, in a sense, providing a kind of a reality check. We're saying, actually, let's observe that it is actually as dangerous to massively destroy the environment as it is to destroy people. And criminal law is all about keeping us safe. Murder isn't a crime to punish murderers. That's how it works. But what it's there for is to stop us killing each other because it's dangerous. Yeah. So effectively what we're doing here is it's a kind of subtle but profound shift in the way we think about our relationship with the natural world. It brings us back to a kind of recognition that we're both part of and completely dependent upon that living world around us.
Most of us have woken up to the idea of where and how we spend our money can be our loudest vote. But what about where we keep our money, who we bank with? Well, according to the Consumer Association, UK high street banks are amongst the worst culprits when it comes to financing fossil fuels, arms companies, and frankly, all the stuff we don't think about when we talk about positive change. Triodos Bank have been blazing a trail for the financial sector in ethical and sustainable banking for over 40 years. They're top-rated by Ethical Consumer magazine, named Best Ethical Financial Provider at the British Bank Awards, and they're also been Which Eco Provider for a second year in a row for refusing to lend or invest in fossil fuel projects, focusing instead on renewable energy, nature regeneration, and community projects. Triodos Bank's aim is simple: to be a safe and secure bank for your money while being totally transparent with what they do with your money. And I honestly could not be happier or prouder to have Triodos as a sponsor for If I Rule the World. Wow. So many things firing off in my mind right now. I mean, again, maybe because I'm so disconnected from sort of a sense of where can I stick a flag in the ground and say, this is home. So as a result, I spend a lot of time thinking about Indigenous culture and this idea that Indigenous is more than just a kind of ethnicity. It's a mindset. It's a way of seeing the world. And I mean, I try not to romanticize it, but I probably will end up sounding like I am. But I do know that for a lot of like Indigenous cultures, like that idea that features in the landscape and down to individual sort of non-human beings have a kind of sense of personhood, a sort of animism, if you like.
I mean, for us, many Indigenous spokespeople have spoken out in support of Ecocide law. And there's a kind of intuitive alignment there, I believe, because there's a sense that's sort of deeply, I'm kind of part of the DNA, really, if one has this harmonious reciprocal relationship with nature, that if we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. It really is that simple. That's a fact. And of course, in the Indigenous understanding, that's also a fact on many, many levels. It's a spiritual fact as much as it is a physical fact. But it is simply reality. And it's a reality that we don't yet really reflect in our sort of legal systems that we've sort of built up culturally. And so for them, I think it feels very intuitive to actually have that reflected in the dominant legal system. It's, well, why isn't it already? Which is often, in fact, the response that we simply get from people when we talk about this is like, oh, you mean it isn't a crime already? So there's that kind of sense. But there's also a sense of balance and of as I say, of reciprocity that is there in that Indigenous understanding. I mean, Indigenous cultures on the whole, for example, are not vegan. There's a relationship with eating animals and with killing animals, but it's a very respectful and balanced relationship where there is only a kind of necessity and also a sacredness attached to that, which is something that we've completely lost, of course, in the Western approach. And what's interesting about this is this concept of balance, I think, is that, and I think this is also one of the things that perhaps makes environmental law a little bit murkier than, say, some forms of law, in the sense that we actually have to extract to some degree from the environment in order to survive. But all of nature also does that. Effectively, we are all sort of surviving on the living world that is around us in different ways. What we have lost is that sense of proportion and that sense of balance. And that is something that we need to relearn from Indigenous cultures, I believe, and try to actually weave into the complexity of our modern society that has become so sort of detached. And I'd love to come back to what you were saying about home and about connection, because my sense is that one of the things that is profoundly missing for an awful lot of people in the sort of Western dominated culture, it is that sense of home, is that sense of belonging, that sense of indigeneity. And we protect what we love and we love what we're connected with. And for many people in our very urbanized culture, it's difficult to connect to nature, or we don't have a way of connecting to nature. And that is something that I believe is profoundly, profoundly important. And for me personally, when I moved out of London with my family and came back to this landscape in the west of England, in the Cotswolds, which is a very beautiful kind of rolling landscape of fields and woods and so on, which is super beautiful. But I also realized I'd grown up here, and coming back here, there was this amazing sense of coming home and of actually sort of feeling like this is my landscape, not in the sense that I own it, but in the sense that I belong here. And I remember having actually a very sort of quite a profound moment, actually, where I kind of realized, and this was before I moved into the environmental campaigning arena, but of just feeling that whatever it was I was going to move into next with my life, it was going to be dedicated to that connection with the land. And so I feel that, there are so many cultural elements that are sort of beginning to emerge as really necessary in terms of shifting our cultural mindset. And we sort of see the legal piece, the Ecocide law piece, as kind of working alongside that. It both responds to that and enhances it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting kind of nexus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I sort of feel like I've had the reverse experience. I probably had my strongest sense of home in my early years, my first 10 years of life, where I was born in Kenya, grew up on kind of a state on the outskirts of Nairobi. It's now sort of still a lovely place. And some of the things that now, when I think back, what is this connection? What does indigeneity, indigenous kind of mindset mean if you're so disconnected from your indigenous roots from the point of view of like ethnicity that you're never going to be able to reconnect? Like for me, I'm ethnically so mixed. I've got a grandfather from Sri Lanka, a grandfather from Trinidad, grandmothers from Seychelles. I was second generation Kenyan, all that stuff. Like, how will I ever find my indigenous roots like that? It's almost impossible. But so for when, those early years growing up in what was an estate, it was on a former coffee plantation. It wasn't an area that was completely wild. It was actually, very much transformed by farming and agriculture. But that was where we had lots of pets, lots of dogs, cats. There was like an orphan vervet monkey that sort of kind of hung out as well. And there was an avocado tree at the bottom of this. We didn't even call it a garden. It was more like a little small holding. And that's where all our pets are buried. And for me, that's almost like if someone came and redeveloped that land, which is likely to happen because that's what the world we live in. I can feel that sort of, and these are just my pets. Imagine if my parents were buried there. And I think for indigenous cultures, and when I often hear about land rights and people sort of feeling this incredible attachment to the land that they will not leave no matter what, I kind of get that. And I sort of only like the tiniest taste of it. So I do think, this sense of home and connection, it goes beyond the sort of nature connection that I often hear, which is, well, it's good for our mental health and it's good for our well-being. Like, if we really connected the land in that way, we would absolutely protect it and defend it. And also that something else you said that, again, my lived experience of growing up in Kenya was that sort of immediate feedback from you change a feature in the landscape. So, for example, there was a very steep-sided valley that we would drive through on my school run. It had a sort of mixture of, very kind of temporary structures built up. It wasn't like a shanty town, but it was, I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I was a kid. I didn't really pay attention to those details. It was just people lived there as far as I could see. And what would happen is if an area got cleared for development, so lots of trees were cut down, the next rainy season, there'd be a landslide. And the people that had embedded themselves within whatever the kind of landscape was there, all of a sudden, all their homes got washed away as well. So for me, that sense of if you live in a place where you get that immediate feedback of harm to the environment has consequences, as you said earlier, I think then it rings home. And again, we're almost like, I don't wish that on anyone, and I'm grateful to live in the comfort that I do live in. But it does disconnect you, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And I think one of the things that's emerging that I've been reading about recently, actually, which is remarkable, is that one of the key solutions, if you like, to the situation that we find ourselves in globally with climate and ecological breakdown is actually the re-anchoring of nature in landscapes that have been they've been desertified and so on. And what I've been reading has been nature has extraordinary power to regenerate. If we actually leave her alone, very, very quickly, you find that the water cycles, the seed cycles, the kind of the biodiversity will start to come back very quickly. And what that's kind of highlighted to me is what a level of effort we must be putting in to actually destroy nature at the level we're doing. It's almost like we must have to be trying really hard to do that. And yet, if we look to nature for those solutions, and we realize that actually when you, for example, regreen or reforest, not necessarily in a plantation way, but in a kind of rewilding way, an area, the temperature in that area drops by up to sort of 15, 20 degrees. I mean, massive differences, when the hydrological cycle is rebooted and so on. And I think that there's something around that sort of renaturalization that is something that we get so caught up in this idea that emissions are the key problem without necessarily connecting the biodiversity and climate thing and realizing that actually destruction of habitat is one of the key issues in terms of climate, and also one of the most easily mendable issues as well, as in it's one of the most easily fixable things. So and I think these things all sort of play in for me around that kind of sense of connection to land. I mean, if let's say every smallholder in the global south were to effectively look at allowing their land to regenerate, being careful about how they manage grazing, for example, and wherever those things are possible across the whole world, actually, but particularly in those areas that are warmer, how fast that could actually change the trajectory that we're in. So yeah, I mean, that, as I say, that's sort of a little bit of a digression that you made me sort of think of with your story of the landslides and so on. Because of course, as soon as you remove the green cover and as soon as you remove the tree cover and that kind of biodiversity, you do just expose land to desertification, to landslides, to floods, to much more vulnerability to the weather. So you end up with this sort of vicious circle. But it's interesting as well. I kind of wanted to come back to what you were saying about the sense of rootedness, because I mean, like you, perhaps not quite so widespread, but I'm also a bit of what I call a mongrel. I've got sort of Indian roots on one side, sort of Irish and German on another. And yet I grew up in England. And I kind of feel, I sometimes have people say to me, don't you feel pulled to go and spend time in India? And obviously I'd be fascinated to do so. But for me, it's not actually where my roots are. My connection is to the land here. And what is, I think, interesting is that I think that people can find roots. I mean, I know people who have sort of, effectively traveled a lot and then said, oh, I found where I want to be rooted. I found the land to which I connect. And I don't think that necessarily has to be where one's ethnic origins are, where one's childhood was, although that I can see that that's fundamentally important. And so I suppose for me that gives a sort of seeds of hope for those of us in cultures that don't have that there is potentially a way, even if it's in quite a small way, of kind of finding somewhere that one can actually connect with, that's possible to do, even from a sort of urbanized background. But I mean, I hope that that's the case anyway.
Well, I mean, what's the alternative if you don't believe that, right? That's for me, that's what hope means. You don't have the evidence that it can work, but you're going to keep trying. And certainly for me, yeah, I do feel that very kind of deep sort of longing for something, and that feeling of I may never get it makes me kind of work harder for it. But listen, hallelujah to that digression. You've just nailed something that I really struggle with. The climate reporting in terms of kind of mainstream coverage, particularly because, oh my gosh, this is like that. Okay, be careful what you say now, Gillian, because I do feel we've become very like blinkered and narrowly focused on this single metric of atmospheric carbon. And what you've said, again, I think for most people there will be, and I say most, I can't say for sure how many and what proportion, but that sense of lived experience of knowing that when you're in a greened urban environment, it is going to be cooler than in one that has no green spaces. The idea that, yes, atmospheric carbon has an influence on a trajectory where we're headed in terms of global mean temperatures, but not addressing what's happening on the Earth's surface on her skin is kind of like missing a very, very big part of one big lever we could be pulling.
And of course, that brings us right back round to ecocide law, because, of course, effectively, if we can put in place a framework that has decision-making steer in a different direction, that's hugely positive. And I think one of the things that we're missing, actually, that ecocide law can provide is that sort of thought framework. Because one of the things that I profoundly believe about human beings is that we are extraordinarily powerful and creative creatures. I mean, if you look out at what's here on the planet, I mean, the strongest force there is here is Mother Nature. But the next strongest is human intention. Everything else that exists on the planet exists because we dreamed it up and we made it happen. That's how powerful we are. But we forget that because we end up sort of caught up in the systems or the rat races or all of these things. But actually, the simple sort of truth is that when we ask questions as human beings, we tend to find answers. So it's actually about what questions are we asking? And I think that one of the things that the climate and ecological crisis has presented us with is this kind of sense of sort of helplessness and powerlessness. And we see this again, not just at grassroots level, but actually around in the corporate world, in many different sectors. How do we respond to something that's this sort of global level of threat? What are the questions we need to be asking? And one of the real milestones in this movement towards the criminalization of ecocide has been the emergence of a definition that can provide that. And I'm going to, this thing you may have seen me do before, but I'm going to hold up this business card, because the core of the ecocide definition that emerged from the international expert panel that our foundation convened in 2021, the core of it fits on the back of a business card. Now, that may seem like a small thing. I mean, it quite literally is a small thing, but it is also hugely powerful, because when you're dealing with politicians, mostly they haven't got time to read through your 20-page report. So the fact that you can actually just read this, and I will because it's just one sentence, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, it's such a simple definition, and yet it's strongly based on legal precedent. So anyone who's worked in this area legally will recognize that terminology. But it's also incredibly understandable to you or me or handing it to somebody in the street. So most environmental regulation is so specific. It's reams of pages around exactly how much of what toxin you can use in what context. This instead is a bit more like, I suppose you could say it's almost a bit more like a crime of murder. It's not about how you do it. The fact that it's murder is because someone's ended up dead. And the same effectively would be true here with ecocide. It's not about exactly how you create the damage. It's about the level of damage you create or potentially create. And so it maintains a kind of breadth of application while at the same time avoiding finger pointing. And that's an extraordinary balance, actually, that has enabled this kind of conversation to grow at a remarkable rate in the political world.
Absolutely. Wow. Jojo, I'm going to test you a bit, challenge your faith in human creativity and intention, because like conceptually, I love all of this. I'm like, I want this to happen. The flip side of what I'm seeing in the world right now is that the meting out of justice, if you like, in terms of war criminals, etc., seems to be quite selective. I'm not going to name names because I'm new to podcasting and I don't want to bury this podcast in a libel case, but I'm sure people know who I'm talking about, so I'm going to leave that there. Some people seem to be brought to justice while others don't. So a couple of questions. First of all, you mentioned that these laws are sort of like the bark needs to be almost worse than the bite, in the sense that it's meant to prevent the crime from happening in the first place, rather than prosecuting once the damage is done. And also making sure that everyone is brought to justice. If we're talking about system change, it sounds like Ecocide is fundamentally about system change, but it almost suggests to me, where there are these pitfalls and possible failings even, that we're going to have to kind of dig deeper and find where are these invisible barriers within the Stop Ecocide movement. How do you see that all kind of panning out? How do you address the kind of pitfalls?
I think this is really interesting because, of course, you can point to the international crimes that exist, as indeed you just did, and sort of say, well, look, how well are these actually prosecuted and who are the people that end up being prosecuted? And there have been accusations of sort of neo-colonialism leveled at the International Criminal Court because of who they've prosecuted or not in the past. And all of that is very valid. I think what is interesting about the context of ecocide and sort of naming ecocide as a crime specifically is kind of interesting and slightly different to, for example, war crimes and genocide. I mean, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is meant to be a complementary court. It's not meant to be the first place you go. It's meant to be the court that backs up when a national system, a national jurisdiction can't or won't prosecute. And of course, if you're a war criminal, your own state isn't going to be prosecuting you, almost by definition. And the same is often true with genocide. So in a sense, almost by default, the sort of place of justice ends up being at the international level. Now, actually, with ecocide, that's not true, because ecocide is largely, not exclusively, but largely a corporate crime. And so the people involved will be potentially those in positions of power in corporations or possibly in policymaking. But the thing is, what that can do is actually restore the ICC to its intended role as a complementary court, because the idea is that if you ratify a crime at the International Criminal Court, you're likely to include it in a very similar form into your own domestic legislation, because that's the logical corollary of doing that. And ultimately, prosecutions for ecocide are likely to take place in national jurisdictions, and they can take place wherever a country has ratified that crime. So it's not like, the ICC is suddenly going to get inundated with cases. It's actually, in practice, is likely to be carried out at a national level. But I think there's another aspect to this that speaks to the deterrent side that you were talking about, which is, let's say you're a genocidal maniac. You probably don't care that much about your PR. That's not your primary concern. Now, as a CEO, on the contrary, it is absolutely your primary concern, because it directly affects not just your personal reputation, but it affects that of your company. So if you've got the potential of a sort of tap on the shoulder for a criminal case as a key C-suite executive, you're looking not only at a threat to your personal reputation and your personal freedom, you're looking at a threat to the reputation of your company and actually its stock value. And you only have to look at for example, the Enron case with the uncovery of the fraud, is that you end up with a plummeting value on the stock market. So there is a way in which this has a kind of deterrent effect that other crimes might not have in that same arena of atrocity crime, if you like. However, you're absolutely right. Criminalizing something doesn't stop it from happening. It makes a big difference to what people's attitude is towards it, and it probably prevents an awful lot of it happening. But of course, because it's prevented, it's not like we can point and say, oh, that was stop there, stop there, stop there. What we still see are those incidences where it does happen. But in that kind of, to sort of extrapolate that logically, just because people still steal and people still murder, are we thinking that we should legalize those things? Make them okay? No, of course not. Effectively, what we're doing is we're drawing a line in the sand. And a good way of looking at that is the example I often use is the Child Protection Act in the UK, which came in 1989. Before that time, actually, it still feels terribly recent to me, but before that time, you basically could discipline your child however you saw fit. And I still have friends whose parents actually campaigned against that law because they believed that they wanted to retain the right to discipline their children as they saw fit. And yet the kind of consciousness, the sort of public consciousness had evolved to the point, at that point at the end of the 80s, where it was possible to legislate and say, no, beating your child is now a crime, for example. But it may still have been in the UK that a large percentage of the population might not have been on board with that law. But once it became a crime, they start becoming on board with that law. So you have this kind of crossing point where consciousness has to evolve to a certain point to recognize that a new law is needed. And of course, this happened as well with genocide and crimes against humanity, as we described earlier. But then from that point onwards, the cultural shift is also influenced by the law. So if you stop someone in the street now in Britain and say, is it okay to beat your child? Everyone's going to say no. And that's partly because it is perceived to be criminal. So we have this kind of overlap that happens culturally, which means that almost regardless of how effective the mechanism is once it's in place, and of course there are I guarantee you, many hundreds of lawyers, if not thousands of lawyers around the world who really want to get their teeth into this when it's in place. But almost regardless of that, the very fact of acknowledging it as criminal actually starts to create what you might think of as a cultural taboo. And that is really important because we have profound taboos around destroying people. We're not going to go to a government and say, oh, can I have a license to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, it's just not even going to cross your mind because it's so profoundly, wrong, criminal, insane, all of those things. But we don't currently have that same repulsion from, oh, we're going to remove a few mountaintops or, we're going to deforest. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that, for example, I'm going to use again an example from home. So in the UK, we have this project for an express railway called HS2 that's been being developed over some years. And one could imagine that if ecocide laws had been in place, it's not necessarily that project wouldn't have happened, but I reckon you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar it wouldn't have gone through 108 ancient irreplaceable woodlands. Because actually that would have been ecocidal. And people would then have got creative about how do we do this? If we really want this, how do we do this in a way that is not going to destroy those ancient woodlands? So, those are the kind of ways that I see that kind of interacting. Of course, it's not a perfect solution. Of course, it's not a silver bullet. Nothing is. But the sort of drawing of that line in the sand has profound ramifications in so many different ways.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you got me back on board. Well, not that I'd ever really stepped off the train, let's face it. So thank you. Thank you for reminding me of all of that. I've sort of wanted to leave talking about Polly Higgins to the end because I know that she was incredibly, pivotal in making this happen. But what I really wanted to hear from you, kind of as a closing thought, is the friendship. What was it like working with her, and what is it like continuing her legacy now?
Polly was a remarkable person, absolutely. She was very much the figurehead and the inspiration for this movement. I met her in 2014, and it was one of those kindred spirit moments. I mean, it was within half an hour, we were sort of sitting across the table going, well, we're obviously going to be working together.
What was she like, though?
She was extremely, she was sharp as a tack. She was very, very funny. She was hugely warm. She had an extraordinary ability to, when you were speaking with her, you always kind of felt like you and what you were saying were the most important things in the world at that moment. And that's an extraordinary quality. And it had people falling in love with her right, left and centre. I mean, men, women, everyone. She had this extraordinary ability. And she once said to me, I once kind of said to her, how do you do that? And she said, and she had this lovely sort of soft Scottish accent. She said, oh, JoJo, she said, oh, it's easy. You just have to be present. And it was that sense of she had this extraordinary presence, this extraordinary ability to be present. And, she also, and clearly, when she kind of had this moment of epiphany, which she really did have around this, where this question came to her, how do we protect the earth? She was just on the verge of, really quite successful barrister's career that she had been working on for some years. And she kind of set it all aside and just said, I need to answer this question. And so there was this, she had this quality of the willingness to really change her life completely in service to this question. And again, it comes back to that thing of the questions. You ask the questions, you find the answers. And that's kind of what she spent the rest of her life doing. She spent the last 10 years of her life dedicated to this particular route. And I think the other thing that I guess it's not that I didn't know it, but it's really come home to me in the last few months, actually, that of course she didn't intend to make that early exit. And she certainly didn't expect that to be what would happen. Although, to be fair, she did have death threats and things like, she had the brakes on her car and her motorbike were tampered with at different times. And she did have attempts on her life.
As a result of this work?
Yeah, as a result of this work.
Wow.
Now, in a sense, after the Paris Agreement and sort of moving forward, she was less worried about that because she sort of felt, and I think probably correctly, that there was a sort of point that was sort of where it kind of got past the point where the removal of one person would actually change the sort of overall direction of how things were going. And I certainly never felt that level of threat in any way. But when she passed away, she really became a martyr to the cause. It was really a genuine sacrifice, although it wasn't intentional. And there was this extraordinary thing that happened where when she became ill, and it was very fast, it was literally a month between her diagnosis and her passing, where the community that was following her and that was the sort of initial membership, obviously, of this campaign, this organisation that's now Stop Ecocide International, people saying this is awful, what's going to happen to the work if she dies? And actually, will it die with her, kind of thing? And the exact opposite happened. So when she passed away, I mean, I literally almost didn't have time to breathe, because what happened is so many people started getting in touch with me saying, what can we do to help you make sure this happens, that this continues? And it became, so campaigns, lawyers, politicians who had often been inspired by Polly themselves, but had possibly sat back saying, well, she's doing this, so I don't need to. And actually, of course, that realization of actually this has to happen was what kind of started bringing people together. And it's been this sort of gigantic kind of dot joining exercise, you could almost say. And I think also, to begin with, I mean, my training was in campaigning and communications rather than specifically law, although obviously in terms of this particular area of law, I'm quite expert in it, as you can imagine. But I remember feeling like a terrible imposter when she died, thinking, okay, I'm going to deal with all these lawyers and all of this. And actually, the politicians less so, because obviously I was a campaigner, so I was already used to those levels of communication. But the evolution has been quite interesting, from really quite a sort of on-the-ground, grassrootsy sort of feel to what we now are, which is a global organisation dealing regularly at the diplomatic and political level, and actually having to take a certain step back, because actually what the realisation has been is that this is actually, as Polly always said, this is a missing law. This is actually a law that is required to protect human civilization, actually, as well as the planet. It really is a kind of has these everywhere ramifications, and that it's so important that we don't make this into a fight. Obviously, if you're an indigenous land defender and some company has come to you and is destroying the forest around you, the fight is being brought to you and you must fight. There is no option about that. There are many, many situations around the world with environmental destruction where it is a fight for that very reason. But in the level of this conversation that we're kind of nurturing, I suppose you could say, at the diplomatic level and at the civil society level, for me, this is not about a fight. This is an inevitable thing. This is something that we all need, that ultimately we all want, and that governments will need if they're going to protect their landscapes and their people and their populations.
Quick roundup questions. Do you have a favourite animal, favourite plant, favourite landscape?
Well, I think probably, the beech woods in spring around here are just extraordinary. That incredible pale golden greeny colour that comes with the first leaves of spring. And often the bluebells are out at the same time, and you have this extraordinary deep purple and this pale goldy green and the sort of the sunlight through the trees. And that's just it's just amazing.
And then last but not least, I have to ask, it's the name of the podcast, If I Rule the World. Jojo, if you rule the world, what would you do?
Well, I think you can probably guess that one pretty quickly. So I would put in place a criminal law of ecocide as a key protective parameter for the interaction of human civilization with the living world around us. That would be the first thing I would do.
You got my vote. Thank you so much, Jojo.
You're really welcome. It's lovely to speak with you.
Wow. What do I take away from that? The importance of friendship. The importance of having a really strong figurehead, someone that inspires confidence. But sadly, when that person is no longer with us, that they're not indispensable. In fact, they inspire people to pick up the challenge and to run with it. And Jojo, along with the whole team at Stop Ecocide International, is doing exactly that. But if there was one thing that I would have to take away from that conversation, which is sometimes, and I can really learn from this, you can just keep it short and simple. Sometimes making the world a better place is so intuitive that, as she said, it can fit on the back of a business card. You're kind of almost left with, is that it? Is that all it takes? And I'm almost tempted to say, yeah, that is it. Keep it short, keep it simple. So if you enjoyed that conversation, if you want to hear more, follow the podcast. I would love you. It would really help us out if you share this with anyone that you think is going to feel inspired. Times are tough right now. A bit of inspiration would be nice. If it spurs someone on to take up a challenge, whatever, just please keep that conversation going. We'd love to hear from you as well. You can email us at podcast@gillianburkevoice.com. And you know what? Take a breather. Take a few moments off the back of that conversation and ask yourself, if you rule the world, what would you do?